I thank the chairman. I thank the chairman for his good work. I thank my colleague August Pfluger for bringing forward today's legislation. U.S. elections should be for U.S. citizens only. A simple premise. When I began my work on trying to stop non-citizens from voting in the United States, I was often told by people that they didn't believe that this was actually the case. That's how radical of a provision exists in Washington, D.C. law. Let's set the stage for folks listening today. Let's set the stage to understand how radical this provision is in Washington, D.C. To be eligible to vote in municipal elections in our nation's capital, an individual only has to reside in Washington, D.C. for 30 days. So let's walk through that. So an individual who works at the Russian embassy, holding a Russian passport in their pocket, residing in the United States capital of Washington, D.C. for simply 30 days, could walk out of the embassy, walk to a polling location, because Washington, D.C. does not even have photo ID, would not need to pull out their Russian passport out of their pocket, and would be eligible to vote for mayor in our nation's capital. What the Democrats want to do, Mr. Speaker, is use Washington, D.C. as a petri dish for liberalizing voting laws across the country. What my Democratic friends want to do, Mr. Speaker, is allow non-citizens to vote across the country. The arguments that are being made fail on the merits when you recognize that the law, in fact, the law today allows non-citizens who simply resided in the nation's capital for 30 days to be eligible to vote. Again, individuals working at embassies across this city are eligible to vote for positions like mayor, alderman. That is the height of hypocrisy. We need to make sure that U.S. elections are for U.S. citizens only. In our nation's capital, we should be looking at a whole host of election law reforms. In fact, I'm of the belief that we should make Washington, D.C. the gold standard of election laws, to actually show the American people what happens when we put in place provisions with strong election integrity. My colleague across the aisle referenced legislation that Republicans are working for. Well, let's take an example and let's dig into that for a moment. Let's look at the election integrity law that was passed in the state of Georgia. This, if we recall, in 2021 was a law that then President Joe Biden called Jim Crow 2.0. In fact, the stories that were told about that legislation earned him, I think, 4 Pinocchios or whatever they call that in the Washington Post. This is how ridiculous it was. Corporate America bought into the misstatements and the falsities of President Biden. If we recall, Major League Baseball removed the All-Star game out of Atlanta, Georgia, following Georgia passing this piece of legislation. Well, of course, 2 elections have passed since that legislation went into effect, so we should look at the empirical data, not at the statements that were made, the hyperbolic statements that were made by my colleagues on the left. We should look at the empirical data of what took place when those reforms were implemented. And what we saw was people increasing their confidence in our elections. That is a good thing. That is a good thing. And the University of Georgia, Georgia State, put forward a robust survey of how elections were conducted in the state of Georgia. And what they saw was high voter participation and people actually having a positive view of how election results were conducted. If I recall correctly, there was 0% statistically of blacks that had a poor or negative voting experience. We should champion that. We should work to instill election integrity provisions across the board. Because when people increase their confidence in our elections, they're more likely to participate. And that's a good thing. What we want is U.S. citizens participating in our election. But what we see from my colleagues on the left is a whole host of policies that actually weaken election integrity. We've held debates as it relates to photo identification. Again, another provision that should be in Washington, D.C. law. Photo identification is almost the rock stone of what is election integrity. It's making sure people are who they say they are, a simple provision. I'm often reminded of a time when I was driving home in Wisconsin, heading back home, and I walked in to grab a 6-pack of beer. The clerk recognized me and said, "Hey, Brian, how you doing?" I said, it's good to see you. I set my six-pack of beer on the counter, and she said, "Brian, I need to see your ID." So just like every American, what did I do? I reached in, I grabbed my wallet, I pulled out my ID, and I handed it over to the clerk. In my opinion, I think it's absolutely nuts that we protect our beer more than we protect our ballots in our nation's capital. We should be looking at ways to strengthen election integrity here in our nation's capital, the front door for many folks to the greatest country in the world. Instead of fighting back and saying, yes, in our nation's capital, that, as the Democrats will say, that we should allow non-citizens to be voting in our nation's elections, we should actually be saying, no, let's use Washington, D.C. as the gold standard of election integrity. And what I believe we will see is exactly what we saw in Georgia. Despite the hyperbolic statements being made by past President Joe Biden, by my colleagues on the left, what we'll actually see is an increase in confidence in our elections. We'll see growing participation. We'll see a strengthening of our democracy. It's why this legislation is such an important step forward in the process of strengthening the integrity of our elections, increasing Americans' confidence, and garnering additional voter participation across the country. I think it's relevant to also note that last Congress, this bill came before us. 52 of our Democratic colleagues voted with every Republican in the House. It'll be interesting today, Mr. Speaker, to see how many of my colleagues across the aisle have the courage to stand up and to say U.S. elections should be for U.S. citizens only. The big difference here is now we have an opportunity to see this legislation move forward in the United States Senate. This is a bill that could actually be signed into law. We have an opportunity for the first time in a number of years to not only pass election integrity legislation here in the United States House of Representatives, we have an opportunity to pass election integrity legislation into law. Let me tell you, I'm excited about the opportunity to stand there when President Trump signs this bill into law, because this is an opportunity for a major step forward in election integrity here in our nation's capital, but also a statement across the country. Because as I believe, the radical Democrats want to use Washington, D.C. voting laws as a petri dish to roll out their plan across the country. My colleagues on the radical left would like to see non-citizens voting in my home state of Wisconsin, in small communities, big communities, all across this country, to drive forward and assist them in advancing a radical agenda. It's why making sure that we pass this law today is so important. To make sure that we're standing up for common sense, to make sure we're standing up for election integrity, to make sure that we're making only U.S. citizens having a voice in U.S. elections. This legislation should be straightforward to my colleagues on the left, although I'm afraid it won't be. I am proud to know that I believe every Republican who votes today will vote yes on this important measure, because it's the Republican Party, it's my colleagues of common sense, that believe we need election integrity in our nation's capital. But more importantly, we need election integrity across the country. And as we begin this effort, I think we have an opportunity as Americans to see increased confidence in our elections. And once again, when we increase confidence, we increase participation. Our principle should be U.S. elections are for U.S. citizens only. This legislation does that, and I encourage my colleagues to vote yes. I yield back.